Hello, I'm John Nichols, and I want to welcome you to a special edition of the Capital Times Ideas Fest for 2022. We'll be talking with United States Representative Ro Khanna. Ro Khanna is a member of Congress who represents the Silicon Valley, but in many senses, in this globalized and digitalized moment, Ro Khanna is a representative for the whole of the United States as regards a discussion about the application of technology, about the expansion of opportunity, and about the renewal of the American economy and its extension to deal with the issues of the 21st century. That's made Khanna a very closely watched and very relevant figure in our politics, and someone whose writings and discussions have gathered notice not just in the United States, but around the world. In fact, when his 2022 book, Dignity in the Digital Age, came out, one of the greatest thinkers of our time, Jürgen Habermas, said of it, "In this passionate and inspiring book, Khanna offers a vision for creating spaces for rational exchange in digital media that do not serve first and foremost economic interests. I am impressed by the precise imagination of this well-informed politician." For those who know the contribution that Habermas has made, that is a remarkable compliment for any writer, and certainly for a member of Congress. But then listen also to what the Guardian newspaper in London had to say. Just on the evidence of this new book, Ro Khanna is one of the broadest, brightest, and best educated legislators on Capitol Hill. His book is bulging with ideas about how to transform big tech from a huge threat to liberty into a genuine engine of democracy. Congressman Ro Khanna, welcome, and thanks for joining us. I feel a little bit remiss in inviting anyone to live up to those sorts of compliments.
Well, thanks for that overly generous introduction. Last time we were in a car from Janesville, Wisconsin to Dubuque, Iowa, far less exalted planes than Habermas and the Guardian. So I look forward to the conversation.
Well, the congressman lets the cat out of the box and reveals that we've known each other for a very long time, and that we have spent a good deal of time together discussing these issues, not just in Washington, D.C., where I've interviewed him many times, but also around the country, where I've followed the congressman's activities as he's done something that is very rare for a member of Congress, and that is to spend an immense amount of time off camera, far from where the political action is, or at least where the political elites gather, in working class towns, trying to figure out the issue of deindustrialization in the United States, the loss of jobs, the loss of opportunities, and how Congress, the federal government, and the private sector might respond to that. And what the congressman just referred to was a recent trip that he made to Janesville, Wisconsin, where he talked with working class folks, local officials, academics, about a concept called economic patriotism. And I think that's a very good place to begin. Congressman, tell us what you mean when you talk to people about economic patriotism.
Well, John, let me try to connect Habermas with our trip. All Habermas in its essence is saying that the wisdom lies with ordinary people, that they have the wisdom to help shape policy when you're listening to them in a thoughtful way. So this idea that we actually should go to communities that have faced the offshoring of job, offshoring of production, and hear what they have to say about their life experiences seems to be obvious. And that's what I've been doing. And one of the things that I've found out as I went to Anderson, Indiana, and had a friend who was an 80-year-old man came up to me with a binder. And I said, "What's in this binder?" It was plant closing after plant closing after plant closing for 40 years. And you hear the stories, and you hear it wasn't just the loss of jobs. It was the destruction of communities. People would say, well, often one of the spouses had to go somewhere else to find work, and the marriage fell apart. Someone didn't find work, and they committed suicide. People used to know about each other's families in a factory. They would celebrate Christmas together. They'd celebrate the holidays together. Now that was gone. And the reality is, since 1980, the middle class and working class has lost 25% of wealth in America. 25% of wealth. 58% of Americans think that the American dream is past us, the America's best days are behind us, in part because of the decline in wealth, the decline in economic prospects. Now, there are a lot of explanations for that, but one of the explanations is we made a strategic blunder. We said that production doesn't matter, that it didn't matter whether we're making things in this country. And part of my message is that we can make things in America, not just the semiconductor chips, not just the batteries, not just the electric vehicles, but also masks, also baby formula, also drugs, and that we can use technology to have skilled advanced manufacturing to sort of bring the new industries, new factories across this country, revitalize the economic prospects of the working and middle class, make sure the workers through unions are getting their fair share, and that can be a project that brings Americans together. That's really what I mean by economic patriotism.
When you use this term economic patriotism, of course, you have people who make immediate comparisons to Donald Trump's economic nationalism. But in many senses, this is the opposite. Explain why.
3 reasons. First, economic patriotism is inclusive. It talks about the opportunities for Black Americans, many of whom faced the worst consequences of deindustrialization. And I was in Chicago, 45-year-old Black worker was talking about how when he was growing up, many of his friends made 30, 40 bucks an hour in the steel mills. Now they're making 17 bucks an hour. The same thing happened in Dayton and Milwaukee. So it is saying to build our economic future, it's got to be Black, it's got to be Latino, it's got to be white working class, it's got to be Asian, it's got to be LGBTQ plus, it's got to include women, that we need everyone on the playing field. Trump's economic nationalism has a polarizing, divisive, exclusive quality to it. And by the way, immigrants are part of the economic production that we're going to need. Second, Trump had the rhetoric of bringing jobs back, but his policies, his signature policy was a tax cut to corporations that basically fueled more offshoring. Where were the new industries? Where were the new factories? The final point is economic patriotism is not xenophobic. Rebalancing production with China will, in my view, help create stability, help avoid the opium war, which was caused in part by structural trade deficits. The goal isn't sort of a jingoism. The goal is American leadership with a world at peace. And so you can have economic patriotism while still having engagement in a global community.
And that's a really important concept, that you came into politics many years ago as an anti-war candidate for Congress in a congressional district, a race you didn't win.
I think you're the only one who wrote about that race, John.
Well, but it was an important race because it was as a young American questioning the war in Iraq. And you have been very closely identified with efforts to end military adventures abroad, to guide U.S. foreign policy toward diplomacy and cooperation. In many ways, you've been an anti-war congressman. And so it's very interesting that you would see an economic policy as a way to avoid war. Clearly, you have the anti-war credentials, but it's not often that someone who's working in the area of economics says, this is a key part of it. So let's dig into that for a moment and note that when you talk about economic patriotism, you really are talking about creating a relationship with other countries that ultimately leads more likely to peace than to war.
Well, my North Star has been, as you know, my grandfather. He spent, Amarnath Vidyalankar spent 4 years in jail during Gandhi's independence movement in the 1940s and the fight for India's independence. That animated my early opposition in 2003 to the Iraq War. It's animated my opposition to the Patriot Act, animated my involvement with Bernie Sanders to pass the first War Powers Resolution to try to stop the war in Yemen. But my view is what will give us the chance of having a just foreign policy? In my view, the best chance of that is to have a multiracial, multi-ethnic America that works as a pluralistic democracy. And what's the best chance of getting a multiracial, multi-ethnic America, a pluralistic working democracy. We want to make sure that all our citizens are feeling part of contributing, are feeling part of being productive, that there is some common work, common prosperity that we can aspire towards. And partly maybe this is growing up in Pennsylvania and now representing Silicon Valley. I grew up in a place where a lot of the folks in the working class, even the white working class, believed in me. And so I still believe that it is possible to find common ground between the coasts and the heartland, between the white working class, black working class, Latino working class. And I think an economic patriotism agenda does that. So one, it'll strengthen our democracy, which is the most important. And two, if it's done well and you have enough self-sufficiency, enough inclusion within a nation, then it makes trade and interactions with other countries more possible without devolving into xenophobia, without devolving into conflict. So much of conflict is caused by a lack of self-sufficiency, as Jefferson warned, of course, with the famous embargo of 1808, where he realized, well, we were too dependent on British goods. Well, we don't want to be too dependent on Taiwan or other countries in terms of the conflict. And we don't want to be in a situation where there is resentment because all our jobs or production have gone offshore. And so we want to be engaged in the world. We don't want a Cold War, in my view, with China or other countries, but we want to be engaged in a way from strength and from cohesion within the United States. I think the same point, by the way, is true in Europe. I mean, had Britain not done more about the total deindustrialization of the North, maybe Brexit wouldn't have been as severe. Maybe some of the anti-immigrant sentiment wouldn't have been as severe in parts of Europe had globalization not been unfettered and there had been more of a policy or focus on place-based economic development.
And this term place-based economic development, which is one that you use quite a bit, probably most people are unfamiliar with it. I don't think it's one that's common in the discourse about economics or economic development in the United States. But it's something that when we describe it, everyone in a community like Janesville, Wisconsin, understands it. It is the idea that if we're doing economic development, if we're doing planning as a country, we ought to worry about places that get left behind and make sure that they don't get left behind, make sure that they are a part of building that future. And this is not some crazy radical concept. It is essentially what countries like Germany and what Scandinavian countries do with industrial policy, isn't it?
Yes, John, and you don't have to even be an economist or an academic. You just have to listen to Bruce Springsteen, my hometown, where Springsteen talks about being an 8-year-old riding in his dad's Buick and the attachment he feels to his hometown and the sadness he feels when the textile mills close. And now he's got a son and he's telling his son, take a look at your hometown before we have to leave. I mean, people have an attachment to the place they grew up in. Most people want to stay, by the way, in the place they grew up in. Doesn't mean it's bad to move. My parents moved from India to the United States. I moved from Philadelphia to Silicon Valley. But no one should be forced to move because they can't get a good job. People should be able to stay with their grandparents, with their parents, with their cousins, with their friends, and build a community if that's what they want. And for so much of the last 40 years, we basically said, let the corporations go wherever. Let corporations maximize shareholder profits. You figure out your way. You can get retrained. You can find a new job. And the reality is a lot of people didn't move. Americans are moving less than they ever have before. Partly it's very expensive to move. Partly people have familial ties, community ties that don't want to move. And so we've had a situation where large parts of this country have just been left out. And that is not good for democracy. It's not good for economic fairness. And it's certainly not good to remain the most productive economy in the world.
So you've sought to address this legislatively. You were very involved with the CHIPS Act and with a number of other legislative initiatives that have sought to get the federal government to begin to do something which both parties have frankly resisted over the years, which is to really sort of target investment, look for ways to develop places in this country that have been left behind. You have also acted personally as a member of Congress, using your platform to get resources from places where there are a lot of them, like the Silicon Valley that you represent, out to small towns in the rural Midwest, like Jefferson, Iowa. I went with you a couple of years ago to Jefferson, and tell us a little bit about what you did there in that specific community, but also in the broader context, what you're trying to show with getting investment in a town of about, I think, 4,000 in central Iowa.
Well, we're going to have 25 million of digital jobs, and these aren't just the jobs of computer programmers or software engineers. An automobile, in many ways, a computer on wheels. Many of the new manufacturing jobs are going to require some technological proficiency. These jobs should not just be in New York, Silicon Valley, Austin, and many of them don't require a four-year degree. So at Jefferson, we created a program with Accenture, with, frankly, the Republican governor there, that would get folks trained for 9 months, a credential, and a $65,000 job, and they didn't have to leave Jefferson.
I'm going to stop you right there. Hold on for 1 second. 9 months of training and a credential, and you're talking about maybe a young person, somebody 20, 22 years old, able to stay in their hometown at a $65,000 a year job, which I would tell you, I know in Jefferson is a very good paying job. That's a remarkable promise.
And they've already had a few of the success stories of people who've gone through it and have landed these apprenticeships and jobs. And now we're doing it, by the way, not just in Jefferson with Zoom. We did it in Claflin at an HBCU in South Carolina. We're doing it in Pennsylvania. We're doing it in New York. We're doing it in states across this country with Google, and creating basically a $5,000 stipend for a young person to get a credential, 10 hours a week. And at the end of it, it leads to a $65,000, $70,000 job. Here's the point in Jefferson. When I went there, but this was just announced. It hadn't even been, no student had even gone through it. 800 folks showed up in a high school gym to hear about this. And then it dawned on me that this was not just about technology. This was not just about jobs of the future. This was about hope. This was about having their kids have some opportunity for a better life, for prosperity. I was back home in my district, and I asked folks in my town hall in Sunnyvale, 250 folks showed up. I said, 58% of Americans believe America's best days are behind them. How many of you believe that to be true? 80% of the room raised their hand to say that they still believe America's best days are ahead of us. That's my district. And the reason is because the world is the oyster for many of their kids. That's not the story in places like Jefferson. So we have to give folks in Jefferson hope about what their kids can do in a modern economy. And here's the thing, John. Yes, it can be some of these tech jobs, which now can be remote and don't have to all be concentrated in cities. But it can also be making things, and not just making semiconductors. What about making new PPE equipment here? What about making new antibiotics here? Why can't we have our textile mills repurposed to do interwoven fabrics to be high-end production and have government purchase agreements so that we have a stock of PPE in the future? We can be imaginative about the next generation of manufacturing, of production, of technology jobs across the country, jobs that are familiar, and be honest. It's not saying, okay, we're going to bring everything back that used to be. It's saying we can do these types of jobs using what we've learned in productivity and technology to our advantage to revitalize these places.
And what you just did there is quite remarkable, I think, in the character of contemporary American politics, because you addressed two sort of conflicting elements and brought them together. In this country, there is simply no question that there are dozens and dozens of communities, maybe hundreds of communities, where people have had a shared experience of loss. They have seen major plants close down, as Janesville did, where you were recently, with its General Motors plant, as Kenosha did with its American Motors, then Chrysler plant. And you can name town after town after town. Everyone knows the plants that closed down. Everyone knows what they lost. And there is, among those who had the jobs, and often even among their children, a sense of longing, a romanticism, if you will. They want to bring back that which they knew, because it was when their town was strong and when their town had so many opportunities. So that's one side. And politicians like Donald Trump and others speak to that very, very clearly. And they walk in and say, yep, we're going to bring that back. We're going to renew that which was, even though they know that is a lie, that sort of renewal, bringing back exactly what was, is virtually impossible. And then you have the other side, and sort of the tech fabulists and others who say, oh, the future is going to be great. I mean, we're all going to be living digitally with AI technology, and everything's going to be wonderful, and we're all going to have $1,200 phones that allow us to do everything. And they're talking about a future of the American economy that makes no connection to the other folks. And this dialogue doesn't occur. We got the folks in the small towns, small cities saying, boy, there's something I want and I need, and nobody's talking about it, but maybe Donald Trump is, because he's promising he'll just bring everything back. And then you have the tech folks saying, oh, but this is the future. All of that is in the past. We can't do that for you anymore. What you're trying to do is to build a bridge, right? And to say to those folks in those cities that have been left behind, that future that you hear about, with all the AI and digital and tech, that can be a part of what you have in your town. You can have a future. It can have an industrial character to it. It can have jobs that you will understand in a traditional sense, and new kinds of jobs as well. And you don't have to give up on where you're from. To me, that's a real leap forward in our politics.
Well, John, I appreciate that. Sometimes I don't know if I could have put it as succinctly. I'm trying to understand my own ideas through your interpretation. Yeah. But I think here's the point. I think if I had to pick between the two camps, I think the folks in the towns, in the factory towns, had more of the truth to it, that we do have to make things in America. We do have to produce things in America. We didn't invent the automobile. We didn't invent the jet engine. Those were Germans and British citizens who did that. We figured out the production of it. And this idea that we can all just do service jobs and digital jobs without producing things will leave us vulnerable as a country, will leave communities vulnerable economically, and isn't going to allow actually innovation, because innovation requires production. But the point on production is, well, how do we compete in production in a modern economy? How do we compete with these other countries? Part of it is embracing the technology that allows for a greater productivity, and figuring out, well, what are the types of production, whether it's in textiles, whether it's in drugs, whether it's electronics, that can be done here in America. And you know what, even if part of the automation, they say, well, automation, maybe there are not as many jobs. Well, at least those jobs should be higher paying jobs, because the workers are more productive. Those should be high paying jobs, and that should have a multiplier effect in the community. So if you're going to say, okay, we need less workers, at least make sure they're higher paid workers, and that the shareholders aren't getting all the benefits. But let's figure out that production, and then let's figure out how do we do that in a way that we have the government as a partner for financing, for developing the workforce. And it's a comprehensive approach where you have the community college, where you have faith leaders, where you have business leaders, where you have local and state and federal governments working to build the new industry, the new factories, the new economy. The fundamental point here is, John, this is not original. This is Hamilton. This is FDR. This is the formula, really, that built America. And we just have to summon that spirit again now, to where people really realize that there's this need for scale and boldness in developing the new industries of the future.
Now, as the congressman from the Silicon Valley, it would have been so easy for you to take one part of that equation, right? To speak for the district that you represent, which you do very well, and you're a very meticulous representative. but you chose to expand it out to look at the rest of the country. And I know part of that is an understanding on your part as a former member of the Obama administration, who worked on a lot of issues as regards trade and other concerns, that the country itself had to be a part of our technological future, the whole of the country, not just one section or particular sections. But I think there's also something else. You, to my mind, understand that if we don't get a fairer distribution of our future, right, of our technological and economic future, that the divisions that we see now in the United States, which are very deep and very challenging, will grow deeper and become more challenging. That there is both an economic side and a social side to this. There's also a political side. There is a need to figure out how we have discussions about the future of our economy that don't divide us, but that actually begin to unite us.
And that starts with rebuilding, John, our working and middle class. I mean, it comes from the corporate greed and decision to offshore production and what that meant in communities where you've seen total deindustrialization. Kids are being told to leave. You're hearing a talk of a brain drain. I mean, things that my parents talked about when they left India. I never thought I'd hear that in the United States of America. And then in unfairness towards the working class, in my state, fast food workers, many women of color who are basically being paid a low wage or being told to come in early and not paid for that, harassed, and have no say while they're serving burgers or serving Taco Bell to Silicon Valley multimillionaires. You just can't have a democracy where economic empowerment is denied to so many Americans, not just because they can't pay their bills or they can't be in a house or can't rent. Obviously, those things matter. It's because at its essence, for democracy to work, we have to allow for people to contribute, to produce with dignity. That is something that is core to the American aspiration. And that's being denied. Many people, that what Sherrod Brown calls the dignity of work, the dignity of making a contribution. And so how do we get that in a modern economy? That is the central challenge. And a lot of what I'm saying is that we can do it, that this is actually something that doesn't even have to be just the federal government, that we can call the business leaders, we can call labor leaders, we can call community leaders, and we can say, here's how we're going to start to rebuild America in the new industries, the new jobs, and that this collective project, this project of doing something together can have to maybe help bring us together. And ultimately, John, that's maybe also the critique of what I'm saying, but the hope of what I'm saying is it comes from one's life story. And I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, at the time where it was 90-some% white, and grew up believing that this is fundamentally a decent country, a country that it can come together and that gives everyone an opportunity. Obviously, not blind to the cruel parts of our history, but a sense of still possibility in America, and that animates a lot of my work. And that's the hope that we can still get there.
You've, in our conversation, several times referenced your upbringing in Pennsylvania and your family's history of immigration to this country. I want to dig into that for just a moment because it is such a fascinating story. Your grandfather, as you referenced before, was a member of the anti-colonial movement, the freedom movement in India, who worked closely with Mahatma Gandhi. This is it's certainly a distinctive background for a member of the U.S. Congress, but it's also one that influenced you a great deal. Your understanding of what your grandfather and those around him achieved gave you, I think, a sense of immense possibility to reshape countries and to take on immense power and to do epic things.
Well, my grandfather at a most basic level, his example taught me how much politics matters. I mean, it can determine the fate of people, fate of nations. My entire life being born in Philadelphia and to immigrant parents wouldn't have been possible if India had never achieved independence. The second thing that I learned from his example is that previous generations have had much more daunting odds. After I lost my first election, 19% to 71%, okay, losing an election isn't fun, but compared to being in jail for 4 years, compared to not knowing whether you would ever see your country be free, I mean, the challenges we face today pale in comparison to the challenges that my grandfather faced, or John Lewis faced, or people who marched and fought against slavery faced. And so it put in perspective the sacrifices people have made. And then finally, the sense, which is not as talked about in the Indian independence movement, was linked in part to a degree of self-sufficiency and a degree of labor movement and a sense of economic empowerment. And I'm sure some of my ideas of saying, well, as a country, we need to have economic empowerment, enough economic self-sufficiency, have labor be part of it, I'm sure in some places influenced by my grandfather.
And you, as a child, you went back to India. So you knew your grandfather.
Yeah, I did. And it's interesting. It's because I was in California and was recently in other states like Nevada. And it's interesting when I talked to one of the people I was talking to, I said, I used to go back to visit my heritage in India. And even though I grew up in Pennsylvania and was born there, my parents used to visit India. And they said, well, we used to go to visit Mexico, or we used to go to visit Guatemala. And then I said, and when my parents, I remember my mom on the plane, and when they'd get ready to leave, there'd be all this drama, and she'd cry, and the cousins would cry, and the grandparents would cry. And this person I was talking to said, yeah, that same thing happened when my parents would leave back in Mexico to come back to California. And you realize that the immigrant experience is similar across many different immigrant stories, but it is also a story and an experience of deep patriotism. I often tell people that my parents almost never talked about my rights as an immigrant, the son of immigrants, though I'm sure they may have mentioned it once or twice, but they did talk a lot about my responsibilities. They said, you won the lottery, you were born in America. Don't mess it up. Go work hard. Go make good grades. Go make something of yourself. That's actually the typical experience of most kids of immigrants. Their parents tend to have the most hope for America. Of course, they've chosen to come to America, and the most optimism about America, the most appreciation for America, and they raise often their kids to really want to contribute to the nation.
And it is notable that whatever pressure or encouragement your parents gave you started to take very soon, because you recall that as a child, you were writing letters to the editor of local newspapers at like 12 or 13, giving advice on politics. So politics was something you were drawn into very early.
Yeah, and that was something probably just came from a passion. It was a ninth grade English teacher who said you have to get published, and so everyone in the class did. And so I sent this letter to the editor to the local paper about my views on the first Gulf War. The Bucks County Courier-Times titled it, "Read This 14-Year-Old's Lips, George." I remember how excited I was going into junior high that day, and I literally thought naively, that the president of the United States was going to read this op-ed. And now I joke around, I write op-eds in the New York Times, and I'll be lucky if anyone at the White House reads it, let alone the president. But there was a sense of, wow, this is American democracy. This is a sense where you can have a voice and you can matter. And that I still feel that exhilaration when I'm in town halls, when I'm participating in conversation. People, E.J. Dionne wrote this book, Why Americans Hate Politics. I don't think Americans hate politics. I think they hate the contemporary version of politics. I think Americans are deeply a political people. We love running for student council at third or fourth grade. We love the idea of everyone has an opinion. We love the idea that we can go criticize the president and that the president's opinion is no more valid than our opinion. But what we hate is sort of what politics has become in the modern manifestation of money and TV ads. But at its core, this idea of democracy and having a voice is quite exhilarating.
And you find debate exhilarating. You're willing to take your ideas to places where people disagree with you, or where they may not agree with you, where you've got to work at it a little bit. And that's a difference from a lot of our contemporary politics. We have become, as they say, so siloed that we have a lot of political figures who are very comfortable appearing on one TV network, but not appearing on another. You obviously are a frequent guest on MSNBC and on CNN, but you also go on Fox, what's generally considered to be the conservative network. And you go on as a progressive, as a supporter of Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign, as someone who's been a very strong supporter of the Biden administration on many of its initiatives. And I'm interested in why, when some people choose not to go on Fox and not to go on more conservative programs, you actually often leap at the chance.
Well, we need to have conversations with everyone, and it doesn't help if you're just having conversations with the people who already agree with you. But more deeply, I actually believe in the wisdom of the American people, and not in every given election, certainly not in any given moment, but over time. I would trust the judgment of the American people over the judgment of any single individual, with the exceptions maybe of Martin Luther King here or a Lincoln here and there. I mean, by and large, for most mortal politicians like myself, I think there's a lot to say for relying and listening to the judgment of the American people. And if you have that view, then it becomes much easier to say, well, maybe I'm not getting the full side of the story. Maybe I need to listen better. Maybe I have to understand, where are folks coming from? What is it that people are saying? And that helps make it clear that you're ultimately in the service of a much larger narrative of the American people. And I could argue that that's not just a political view or an American view. I mean, I would say that some of our greatest philosophers, John Rawls, Habermas, tend to be the most humble about their own views, and tend to give large respect to the wisdom of people in a community and in a country. And that's really where I come from, is a sort of a humility about my place in a much larger American story.
It also gives you a certain strength, the listening, because when I saw you in Janesville, Wisconsin, meeting with workers and local lawmakers, as well as academics and others, and when I've seen you in other places around the country, in Iowa, other states, you actually go silent for a good portion of the conversation. You let other people vent sometimes and speak at great length. And it strikes me that while there are many politicians, many political figures who come into rooms sure of what they're going to say and sure of what they'll say at the end, you often go in wanting to hear where the people are at in that room, and sometimes evolving your own thinking, evolving your own response based on it.
I think there are different types of leadership. The traditional model of leadership is the politician walks in the room, sucks all the energy. It's almost like the disciples should be around them, and that is heralded as a charisma. My view is that the type of leadership that we now need is maybe politicians who allow the charisma to be the American people's charisma, and are there to be vessels for their stories, their ideas, their concerns, and help give voice to that. And that's really what I try to do, is to listen to people, to listen to where they're coming from, why they feel angry, what they want changed, how we can be part of that, the solution. And that, I think that people are hungry for wanting people to hear them.
And that's a particularly big deal as regards, again, the issues that we started talking about, these industrial policy issues, the question of deindustrialization itself. because it strikes me that there's a tremendous number of Americans who have felt that they haven't been listened to, that their concerns are not understood by our politics, by our governance. And that has created, in many cases, such a desperation to be heard, or such a desperation to have somebody care, that it has given rise to in some cases, some pretty ugly populism, right? There's been folks who've come along and made wild claims about what they will do for a town that's been deindustrialized, or wild claims about what they will do for workers, and had a certain amount of success in politics in that regard. What you seem to be trying to do is to build a level of trust so that you can, instead of making wild claims, actually put forward a program, put forward a set of ideas that could work. And that's not easy, because you're not yelling as loud as other people, right? What you're actually doing is saying relatively calmly, look, there's a way we can get out of this mess. But to be able to be heard in that regard, you have to spend a lot of time with folks. You have to actually go to towns like Anderson, Indiana, and Janesville, and Jefferson, and Dubuque, and other places. And as I know, walk picket lines with people, sit in union halls late at night, to kind of rebuild that relationship between American politics and people who feel that politics doesn't really connect with them very often.
Yeah, it's to rebuild it, to earn their respect and trust, but also to shape my own thinking of what's possible, of what's relatable. How do you discuss things in ways that are going to appeal for folks? You can't do that just through focus groups or just getting polling or reading papers. You have to see what a community is like, and meet real people with their real stories, and then involve them in the rebuilding economically of a place. But I think sloganeering and it can work at any moment, but there comes a time where people want real solutions. Just like you want a doctor who's actually going to solve your heart disease. There come moments in politics where I call them moments of seriousness, where the country says, yes, we want something that is really going to improve our kids' lives. And you never know when those moments happen in the inflection point of history. But that is, I think, something that is true to what I believe, which is let's have real solutions for legitimate grievances that people have of being left out of the modern economy.
And when you speak in this way, you've caused a number of people, political observers, to say, boy, that guy sounds like somebody who maybe should run for president of the United States. That sounds like a presidential appeal. And in many senses it does. But you've made it clear you're not running against Joe Biden for the Democratic nomination in 2024 or something like that. What you are really trying to do is to shape a different kind of politics, maybe for 2024, but really, going far into the future. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I'd love President Biden, to take as many of my ideas and run with them, and I'd like to be out there stumping for him across the country on this economic patriotism. And if not him, if he didn't run, I'd love to stump for Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. I'm still developing as a political voice, and in terms of these ideas and building. And I'd like to help build the party in a way that gets people thinking, yeah, this is what we can do to bring the country together and to build our economic prosperity. And there's a lot of value in being that kind of a voice surrogate for the party. And so what I would love is for the president in his reelection, or if there's some other candidate, to say, let's get Khanna out there, not just to Asian American communities in the country, which is sometimes how the Democrats think of it, unfortunately, or let's just send them to tech communities. But you know what? Why don't we mix it up? Let's send the guy to factory towns and You really, you got this Asian American from Silicon Valley talking about rebuilding America. Suddenly it starts to capture people's imagination. We have to think out of the box if we want to figure out how we're going to bring this country together.
I want to close by mentioning your book once more. And it is rare for a member of Congress to write a book. Some do, and some write very good books. There have been a few along the way that have stood out. But as a relatively new member of Congress, at a time when you were very, very involved as a co-chair of Bernie Sanders's presidential campaign and a mover on a host of major issues, you carved out the time to write a very serious book about dignity in a digital age, about our economy going forward. Why did you think that was necessary? Because that's sort of a pull the brakes moment, right? Instead of rushing into things, that's like, boy, I've got to go sit someplace and think and write a bit. What made you decide to take the time to do that at this relatively early point in your congressional career?
Well, we had a pandemic, so I was at home and not traveling, so I had more time than usual. But there are two things that made me write that book. A belief that we really had to focus on place, and that so much of this country is being excluded from the modern economy, and we needed a whole different philosophy for modern economic development in rural America, in factory towns, and Black and Latino communities. And I thought I had something unique or new to say about that. But the chapter that I'm proudest of, which doesn't get much attention, but it's actually the reason that Habermas blurbed it, is the last chapter struggles with, well, what does patriotism look like in the 21st century? And it's really a defense of patriotism. It's highly influenced by Frederick Douglass's Composite Nation. And it basically says it's okay to be patriotic, to say that we can root for our home team, root for our home community, as long as that sense of what that community believes, what the nation believes, is shaped by every citizen. And that what makes America this extraordinary place, what's going to be our civilizational achievement, is that we're going to be this composite nation, as Douglass puts it, a nation with people from every part of the world. Never been done in human history to be this multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. And when I think about that, when I think about, wow, this could be one of the crowning moments for America, that again inspires me on days that I'm down, or days where all we're discussing is Mar-a-Lago, to say, no, there's something we're doing here when history looks back at it that will be seen as extraordinarily consequential. And I'm a part of that.
You are indeed a part of it. And it's been a great pleasure to take a little bit of time and talk today about your book, about your travels around the country, and about the vision that you're bringing to our politics. I appreciate so much the way that you integrate these things. And if I can, I just wanted to close off with one last question. And that is about, what do you read? I mean, when you're trying to draw this all together, are there?
I mean, other than your books and columns?
That's very kind. Seriously.
I do, and I don't say that to flatter you. I read people who I think have a understanding of American history, and understanding of American thinkers, because I think so much of what we need to do is rooted in what Lincoln did with the land grants, what FDR did with business and labor and government working to build a productive economy, what Hamilton did. And I also think, and here's where I think I differ from some progressives. A lot of progressives want to convey new, bold ideas as totally different from what came before. And my view is you can have bold new ideas, and if you can ground them in a country's history, in a country's ideals, and in a country's past leaders, I actually think it makes it more likely for them to be accepted. And if you look at some of our most transformational leaders, whether it's Lincoln or King, they did that. So for me, reading about American history helps me say, this isn't that original an idea. Actually, it was back there, it was Truman's idea, it was FDR's idea. Let's just get back to what built America into a great nation.
Bold new ideas grounded in American history. That's a pretty good way to sum up Ro Khanna. Congressman Khanna, thank you so much for joining us in this Ideas Fest conversation. And